Millionaire finds his ex on the street with 3 girls and discovers a secret that changes everything. Hello, welcome, enjoy, subscribe, and activate notifications. Caroline walked down the bustling streets of New York, her daughter's small hands tucked tightly into hers. The city's familiar cacophony, honking cars, distant chatter, and the ever-present hum of life seemed distant as her mind swirled with exhaustion. Each step felt like a trial, her body weighed down by weeks of uncertainty. Her daughters, Ellie, Leah, and Sarah, skipped beside her, their innocent giggles punctuating the tension in Caroline's chest. The 3 of them were her lifeline, her only reason to keep pushing forward despite the crushing weight of homelessness and despair. They passed storefronts adorned with colorful displays, their reflections momentarily catching Caroline's tired eyes. The girls stopped to marvel at a bakery window, their tiny faces lighting up at the sight of pastel macarons stacked in delicate pyramids. Caroline tugged them along gently, her heart aching. She had barely enough for their next meal, let alone treats to indulge their youthful curiosity. But she forced a smile, determined not to let her struggles dampen their spirits. "Maybe next time, girls," she said, her voice steady despite the lump forming in her throat. As they approached a busy avenue, the crowd thickened, and Caroline tightened her grip on the girls' hands. Her heart raced when they reached the curb, the crosswalk teeming with impatient pedestrians and roaring engines. She took a deep breath, counting silently to calm herself. That was when her gaze fell on a sleek black sports car parked just across the street. Leaning against it was a man she hadn't seen in years, David. Her pulse quickened for a different reason now, a mix of panic and disbelief overtaking her. David was the last person she expected, or wanted, to see. His tailored suit and confident stance exuded the same charm that had captivated her years ago. He was engrossed in his phone, unaware of her presence. Caroline instinctively pulled her daughters closer, as if shielding them from an invisible threat. But before she could retreat into the crowd, David looked up. His piercing eyes locked onto hers, a flicker of recognition sparking between them. His gaze then shifted to the girls, and something in his expression changed. Confusion, shock, and realization all at once. Caroline froze, her mind racing with conflicting emotions. She had spent years imagining what she would say if this moment ever came, but now her voice felt trapped. She tried to move, to pull the girls away, but her legs betrayed her. David stepped forward, his expression unreadable, but his eyes fixed on the trio. "Caroline," he called out, his voice tentative yet laced with something undeniable. "Is it really you?" The girls, sensing the tension, clung to their mother's sides. Ellie, the boldest of the 3, peered up at the man curiously. "Who's that, Mommy?" she asked innocently, her voice cutting through the thick silence. Caroline's chest tightened, and she mustered the strength to speak. "Just someone I used to know," she said quietly, her words meant to dismiss but unable to erase the gravity of the moment. David's eyes darted between Caroline and the girls, his face pale. "Are they?" he began, his voice faltering. Before he could finish, Caroline turned sharply, tugging her daughters along with renewed urgency. The crowd enveloped them as she hurried away, her mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. But even as she fled, she could feel David's gaze burning into her back, and the truth she had buried for so long threatening to resurface. The girls asked no further questions, their mother's silence enough to quell their curiosity for now. But Caroline knew she couldn't outrun her past forever. The rest of the walk was a blur. Caroline led her daughters to a small park, seeking refuge among the trees and open sky. She sat on a bench, her heart pounding as the girls played nearby. Her thoughts were consumed by David, his unexpected reappearance, the way he looked at the girls, and the unmistakable resemblance he couldn't ignore. She had kept the secret for so long, convinced it was the right thing to do. But now, with him so close, everything felt fragile, like a dam about to burst. Caroline glanced at her daughters, their laughter filling the air as they chased each other around a fountain. They were her world, her reason for enduring every hardship. She had raised them alone, giving everything she had to ensure they felt loved and safe. But seeing David again stirred something in her she couldn't quite name. Regret, perhaps, or hope. She shook her head, unwilling to entertain the possibility. She couldn't afford to. For now, all that mattered was protecting her girls, no matter what the future held. Caroline barely slept that night. In the small shelter they had found refuge, the sounds of restless strangers filled the dimly lit room. Her daughters huddled together on a thin mattress, their breaths soft and even in the quiet. Caroline watched them, her mind replaying the events of the day. Seeing David again had stirred emotions she had worked hard to suppress: anger, fear, and a faint echo of love that she despised herself for feeling. Morning came too soon, sunlight creeping through the dusty windows of the shelter. The girls stirred, their sleepy faces lighting up when they saw their mother. "Good morning, Mommy," Leah said, her voice warm and sweet. Caroline mustered a smile, though her heart was heavy. "Good morning, my loves," she replied, brushing stray curls from Leah's forehead. The day ahead loomed uncertain, but she knew she had to keep moving, for their sake. After a sparse breakfast provided by the shelter, Caroline led the girls into the city. They had no clear destination, only the goal of finding some sense of normalcy amid the chaos of their lives. As they walked, the girls pointed out dogs on leashes, colorful murals, and the occasional street performer. Their innocence was a balm to Caroline's weary soul, even as her thoughts remained clouded with doubt. Turning a corner, Caroline froze. Parked outside a sleek cafe was the same black sports car she had seen the day before. Her heart skipped a beat as she scanned the street, hoping it was just a coincidence. But then she saw him, David, stepping out of the cafe, a paper cup of coffee in hand. He spotted her almost immediately, his expression shifting from surprise to determination. He began walking toward them, and Caroline's instinct was to flee. But her daughters, oblivious to her turmoil, noticed him too. "Mommy, it's the man from yesterday," Sarah said, her voice tinged with curiosity. Caroline swallowed hard, her body tense as David approached. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze steady but cautious. "Caroline," he said, his voice softer than she expected. "I'm sorry for yesterday. I didn't mean to startle you." She nodded curtly, unsure of what to say. The girls clung to her sides, their wide eyes studying David with a mix of curiosity and wariness. David's gaze shifted to the girls, and Caroline could see the questions swirling in his mind. "They're beautiful," he said quietly, his tone sincere. "They look familiar." Caroline's stomach churned. She had dreaded this moment for years, the inevitable confrontation she had avoided at all costs. "They're my daughters," she said firmly, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "That's all you need to know." David hesitated, his expression pained. "Caroline, please. I think we both know there's more to it than that." His words hung in the air, heavy with implication. The girls looked up at their mother, sensing the tension but unable to understand its depth. Caroline's heart ached as she looked at their innocent faces. They deserved answers, but she wasn't ready to give them. Not here, not now. "I don't owe you an explanation," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. "We've managed just fine without you." She turned to leave, but David stepped in front of her, his expression desperate. "Caroline, wait. If they're mine, if they're our daughters, I deserve to know. Please, just talk to me." His words softened her resolve, but only slightly. She glanced around, aware of the people passing by, their curious glances making her feel exposed. Finally, she sighed. "Not here," she said, her voice low. "I'll talk to you, but not in front of them." David nodded, relief flashing across his face. "Thank you," he said earnestly. "Tell me when and where, and I'll be there." She hesitated, then gave him the address of a nearby park. 2 o'clock, she said. "Don't be late." With that, she walked away, her daughters in tow, her heart pounding with the weight of what she had just agreed to. The hours until the meeting passed in a blur. Caroline took the girls to a library, letting them immerse themselves in picture books while she sat in a quiet corner, her thoughts racing. She replayed every moment of her relationship with David, from the giddy early days to the crushing heartbreak that followed. She had loved him once, deeply, and the wounds he left behind had never fully healed. But the thought of him in her daughter's lives was both terrifying and tantalizing. Could he really be the father they needed? Or would he only bring more pain? When the time came, Caroline walked to the park with a mix of dread and determination. She spotted David sitting on a bench, his posture tense but hopeful. The girls stayed behind with a kind woman Caroline had befriended at the shelter, giving her the space she needed to face this moment. She approached David, her steps deliberate, her face guarded. He stood as she reached him, his expression earnest. "Thank you for coming," he said. Caroline nodded, folding her arms. "Say what you need to say," she replied, her tone cool. David took a deep breath, his eyes meeting hers. "I didn't know," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "If I had known, I would have been there. Please believe me, Caroline. I never would have left you if I had known about them." His words stirred something in her, a flicker of the man she had once loved. But she couldn't let herself be swayed so easily. "It's not that simple, David," she said, her voice firm. "You left, and I had to pick up the pieces. I had to raise them on my own, with no help, no support. You don't just get to walk back into our lives and expect everything to be okay." David nodded, his expression filled with regret. "I understand that, but I want to try. I want to make things right, for you and for them. Please, give me a chance." His plea hung in the air, and Caroline felt the weight of her decision pressing down on her. Could she trust him? Did she even want to? The answers eluded her, but one thing was clear. Their lives were no longer separate, and the path forward would be anything but easy. Caroline sat across from David on the park bench, her arms folded tightly against her chest as if they could shield her from the emotions clawing their way to the surface. She studied him in the soft afternoon light, noticing the subtle changes time had etched into his features. The boyish charm that once disarmed her had matured into something sharper, more refined, but his eyes held the same intensity. It was unnerving how easily he could still affect her after all these years. David broke the silence, his voice low but firm. "I know I can't change the past, Caroline, but I'm not the man you remember. Let me prove that to you." His gaze didn't waver, and she found herself wanting to believe him, though every instinct warned her to guard her heart. "Prove it," she echoed bitterly. "You think you can erase years of struggle with words? I don't need promises, David. I needed you then, and you weren't there." The truth of her words hung between them, heavy and unyielding. David's shoulders sagged under their weight. "You're right," he admitted, his voice tinged with regret. "I can't change the fact that I wasn't there, but I can be here now. For you. For them." His eyes softened, and Caroline could see genuine pain in his expression. "I just want the chance to know them. Please, Caroline, don't shut me out." She hesitated, her resolve cracking under the sincerity in his voice. She had always imagined this moment, but in her fantasies, it had been easier, cleaner. Now, faced with the reality of his presence, she felt torn between the life she had built for her daughters and the possibility of giving them something more. Something she alone couldn't provide. "If I let you in, it's not for me," she said finally, her tone sharp. "It's for them. But I'm warning you, David. If you hurt them, if you let them down even once, you'll lose any chance of redemption. Understand?" David nodded solemnly, his expression earnest. "I understand, and I won't let you down." Caroline studied him for a moment longer before standing abruptly. "You can start by meeting them properly," she said, glancing toward the playground where the girls were playing. David's face lit up with cautious hope as he followed her gaze. "Really?" he asked, a hint of disbelief in his voice. She nodded stiffly, her heart pounding as she led him toward the children. The girls were laughing, their bright voices ringing out as they chased each other around a slide. Caroline called out to them, and they turned, their faces lighting up when they saw her. "Girls," she said, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. "This is David. He's an old friend of mine." She struggled with the words, unwilling to reveal the truth just yet. The girls looked at him curiously, their identical faces reflecting the same mix of curiosity and caution. David crouched down to their level, a warm smile softening his features. "Hi," he said gently. "I'm David. It's really nice to meet you." The girls exchanged glances before Ellie, the boldest, stepped forward. "Hi," she said, her tone both wary and curious. "Why are you here?" Caroline's stomach nodded at her daughter's directness, but David didn't falter. "Well," he said thoughtfully, "I wanted to meet you three. Your moms told me a lot about you." Leah tilted her head, studying him with wide eyes. "You know Mommy?" she asked. David nodded, his smile never wavering. "I do. A long time ago, we were very good friends." Sarah, the quietest of the three, edged closer to Caroline, her small hand gripping her mother's tightly. Caroline gave her a reassuring squeeze, her heart aching at how much her daughters needed reassurance in this uncertain moment. As the girls warmed up to David's presence, they began asking him questions about his car, his shoes, and whether he liked peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. Their innocence was disarming, and Caroline couldn't help but feel a pang of protectiveness as she watched them interact. David, to his credit, answered each question with patience and good humor, his natural charm putting the girls at ease. When it was time to leave, the girls surprised Caroline by hugging David goodbye. "Will we see you again?" Ellie asked, her voice hopeful. Caroline hesitated, but before she could answer, David knelt down and looked Ellie in the eye. "I hope so," he said sincerely. "If your mom says it's okay." Ellie turned to Caroline expectantly, her eyes pleading. Caroline forced a smile. "We'll see," she said noncommittally, her heart heavy with the weight of her decision. As they walked away, David called after her. "Thank you, Caroline," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. She didn't respond, her thoughts too tangled to form words. That night, as the girls drifted off to sleep, Caroline sat by the window of the shelter, staring out at the city lights. David's presence had stirred something in her: hope, fear, and a deep, unrelenting sense of uncertainty. She had spent years protecting her daughters from disappointment, and now she wondered if she had done the right thing. Could she trust David to keep his promises? Or was she opening the door to more heartache? The answers eluded her, but one thing was certain. Their lives had changed irrevocably, and the path forward would demand strength she wasn't sure she had. The next morning, Caroline awoke to the sound of her daughters giggling softly as sunlight poured through the small window of the shelter room. The sound was a welcome reprieve from her restless sleep, during which images of David and their complicated history played out in her mind. She stretched and joined the girls, who were already making plans for the day. Ellie, always the ringleader, declared, "Let's go back to the park. Maybe the nice man will be there." Caroline hesitated, her heart sinking at Ellie's words. The girls had taken to David so quickly, and she worried about what might happen if he didn't show up again. Or worse, if he did, and something went wrong. Still, she didn't want to dampen their spirits. "We'll see," she said vaguely, knowing she would have to navigate this delicate situation carefully. By mid-morning, the girls were dressed and ready to head out. Caroline decided to take them to a small community center she had discovered nearby, where they could play and socialize in a safe environment. It also gave her a chance to clear her head and figure out what to do next. She couldn't deny the impact David's reappearance was having, not just on her, but on her daughters, who were already asking questions she wasn't prepared to answer. At the community center, Caroline watched as the girls joined a group of children in a craft activity. For a moment, she allowed herself to relax, taking solace in their laughter and the sense of normalcy this setting provided. But her peace was short-lived when her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw an unfamiliar number. Against her better judgment, she answered. "Caroline?" David's voice was tentative but unmistakable. She gripped the phone tightly, her pulse quickening. "How did you get my number?" she asked, her tone sharper than she intended. "I asked around," he admitted. "I hope that's okay. I wanted to check in, to see if we could talk again." Alone this time, Caroline sighed, her mind racing. She had hoped for more time to process everything, but she knew avoiding him wouldn't make the situation go away. "Fine," she said finally, "but not today. I need some time." David didn't push, his voice gentle as he replied, "Whenever you're ready, just let me know." After ending the call, Caroline felt a mix of relief and frustration. She appreciated that David wasn't pressuring her, but the weight of the decisions she faced felt overwhelming. She glanced at her daughters, their faces glowing with happiness as they painted colorful pictures. They deserved stability, love, and a father who would be there for them. But was David capable of providing that? Could she risk letting him try? Later that afternoon, as they walked back to the shelter, Ellie tugged at Caroline's hand. "Mommy, when can we see David again?" she asked, her voice filled with innocent hope. Caroline knelt down to face her, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "We'll see, sweetheart," she said softly. "It's complicated." Ellie frowned but nodded, sensing that her mother's hesitation came from a place of love and protection. That evening, Caroline sat in the small common area of the shelter, her thoughts spiraling. She pulled out a worn notebook she used to jot down her thoughts and began writing. The words flowed as she tried to make sense of her feelings. Her fear of letting David back into their lives, her longing for her daughters to have a father, and the anger that still simmered beneath the surface. She didn't notice the hours slipping by until one of the shelter volunteers gently reminded her it was nearly curfew. The next day, Caroline decided to take a bold step. She called David and agreed to meet him at a quiet cafe near the shelter. She arranged for a volunteer to watch the girls, who were thrilled to stay and play with their new friends. As she walked to the cafe, her stomach churned with nerves. She reminded herself that this meeting wasn't about rekindling anything between them. It was about finding clarity for her daughter's sake. David was already there when she arrived, sitting at a table near the window. He stood as she approached, his expression a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Thank you for coming," he said, pulling out a chair for her. Caroline sat down, folding her hands in her lap to steady them. "Let's get one thing straight," she began. "This isn't about us. It's about the girls. If you're serious about being in their lives, I need to know you're not going to disappear again." David nodded, his gaze earnest. "I understand, and I'm not going anywhere. I want to be there for them, Caroline. I want to make up for lost time." She studied him, searching for any sign of insincerity, but all she saw was a man grappling with regret and determination. "It's not just about showing up," she said. "They've been through so much already. They need consistency, patience, and love. Can you give them that?" "Yes," David said without hesitation. "I don't expect you to believe me right away, but I'll prove it. Whatever it takes." His voice cracked slightly, and Caroline saw the vulnerability in his eyes. For the first time, she felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, he was telling the truth. They spent the next hour discussing the practicalities of introducing David into the girls' lives. Caroline insisted on taking things slowly, setting clear boundaries to protect her daughters. David agreed to everything without argument, his willingness to accommodate her demands surprising her. By the time they parted ways, Caroline felt a cautious sense of relief. It wasn't a resolution, but it was a start. Walking back to the shelter, Caroline felt the weight on her shoulders lift ever so slightly. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps, with time and effort, their fractured lives could begin to mend. Over the following weeks, a delicate rhythm began to form. David visited the girls at the community center twice a week, under Caroline's watchful eye. The first few meetings were tentative, filled with cautious smiles and shy questions. But as time passed, the girls warmed to him, their natural curiosity overriding any initial hesitations. Ellie, as always, led the way, peppering David with endless questions about his car, his favorite food, and what he did for work. Leah and Sarah followed her lead, their trust building slowly but surely. Caroline observed these interactions with a mixture of relief and unease. David seemed genuinely invested in getting to know the girls, and his patience with them impressed her. He didn't try to force a connection, instead letting them set the pace. It was a side of him she hadn't seen before, and while it softened her defenses slightly, she remained wary. Years of disappointment had taught her to guard her heart, and she wasn't ready to let go of that caution just yet. One afternoon, as they sat in the small park behind the community center, David pulled out a small sketchpad and began drawing. The girls crowded around him, their eyes wide with fascination. What are you drawing? Leah asked, her voice filled with awe. David smiled, his pencil moving deftly across the page. You'll see, he said, his tone playful. After a few minutes, he turned the pad around to reveal a detailed sketch of the three of them, their faces alight with joy. The girls gasped in unison, their delight unmistakable. Wow, that's us, Sarah exclaimed, her quiet demeanor momentarily forgotten in her excitement. Caroline, watching from a nearby bench, felt her throat tighten. The scene was so achingly normal, so full of the love and laughter she had dreamed of for her daughters, that it caught her off guard. For a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to imagine what life might be like if David truly became a part of their family. But the thought was quickly followed by doubt. Could it really last? Later that evening, as they walked back to the shelter, Ellie held up the sketch David had given them, her face glowing with pride. "Mommy, look what David drew for us," she said, waving the paper enthusiastically. Caroline smiled faintly, her emotions a tangled web of hope and fear. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," she said, her voice soft. Ellie nodded vigorously. "He's so nice, Mommy. I'm glad we get to see him." Caroline didn't respond, unsure of how to voice the storm of feelings swirling within her. She wanted her daughters to be happy, to have a father who loved them unconditionally. But the scars of her past made it hard to believe in that possibility. As they settled in for the night, she found herself staring at the sketch, her heart aching with a mix of longing and uncertainty. The next week, David invited the girls to his home for the first time. Caroline had insisted on accompanying them, unwilling to let them go without her. David had readily agreed, his understanding of her protectiveness further easing her apprehension. When they arrived at his mansion in the Hamptons, the girls' eyes widened in amazement. The sprawling estate was a far cry from the cramped shelter they called home, and Caroline couldn't help but feel a pang of discomfort at the stark contrast. David greeted them warmly, giving the girls a tour of the house and the expansive garden. The girls were thrilled, their laughter echoing through the halls as they explored. Caroline, meanwhile, couldn't shake her unease. She appreciated David's efforts to include her, but the opulence of his lifestyle felt overwhelming, a reminder of the chasm that had grown between their worlds. That evening, as they sat down for dinner in David's elegant dining room, the conversation flowed easily. The girls were full of questions about the house and its many wonders, and David answered each one with patience and humor. Caroline watched him closely, searching for any signs of insincerity. But if he was putting on an act, he was doing a remarkable job. After dinner, David took Caroline aside while the girls played in the garden. "I know this must feel strange for you," he said, his tone gentle, "but I want you to know that I'm not trying to overwhelm you or the girls. I just want them to feel at home here, if they ever want to come back." Caroline nodded, her arms crossed defensively. "It's a lot to take in," she admitted. "But they seem happy, and that's what matters." David hesitated, then said softly, "I hope in time, you'll feel comfortable here too. I want this to be a place where all of you feel safe." His words caught her off guard, and for a moment, she saw a vulnerability in him that mirrored her own. She looked away, unsure of how to respond. "We'll see," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. As they prepared to leave, the girls hugged David tightly, their excitement bubbling over as they recounted their favorite parts of the day. Caroline watched them, her heart heavy with conflicting emotions. She couldn't deny the joy she saw in their faces, but the fear of letting her guard down remained ever present. As they drove back to the city, the girls chattered animatedly about their visit, their happiness filling the small car. That night, as the girls slept soundly beside her, Caroline lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She knew the path she had chosen was fraught with uncertainty, but for the sake of her daughters, she was willing to take the risk. Whatever the future held, she would face it with courage, determined to protect her girls while giving them the chance to experience the love and connection they deserved. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, they were on the verge of something new, something good. The days that followed were a blur of small, tentative steps toward building something new. David continued to visit the girls regularly, each meeting solidifying the growing bond between them. Ellie had taken to calling him Mr. David, while Leah and Sarah alternated between shy smiles and excited chatter. Caroline remained vigilant, her protective instincts unwavering even as she began to see glimpses of the father David was trying to become. One morning, Caroline sat at a corner table in the community center, watching as David helped the girls assemble a small science project they had been assigned for school. Ellie, ever the leader, issued instructions with the authority of a seasoned foreman, while Leah and Sarah giggled at David's exaggerated expressions of concentration. Caroline couldn't help but smile at the sight, a warmth spreading through her chest despite her reservations. Her thoughts drifted to the years she had spent struggling alone. She had been so young when she and David had been together, and when he had left, the betrayal had been devastating. She had vowed never to let herself be vulnerable again. But now, watching him with their daughters, she began to wonder if she had underestimated his capacity to change. Still, the fear of disappointment lingered, a shadow she couldn't ignore. That afternoon, David approached her as the girls packed up their project. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" he asked, his tone tentative. Caroline nodded, motioning for him to follow her to a quieter corner. "What's on your mind?" she asked, her arms crossed defensively. David hesitated, then said, "I've been thinking about the girls' future, about their education, their opportunities. I want to help." Caroline raised an eyebrow, her skepticism immediate. "Help how?" she asked, her voice guarded. "I know you've been doing everything on your own, and you've done an incredible job," he said earnestly. "But I have resources, Caroline. I can give them things we never had growing up. Better schools, experiences that could shape their future. I want to contribute." The sincerity in his voice gave her pause, but the idea of accepting his help felt like a betrayal of the independence she had fought so hard to maintain. "I don't want them to grow up feeling like they owe you anything," she said firmly. "They're not a charity case, David. They're my daughters." David's expression softened, and he took a step closer. "I know that," he said, "and this isn't about me trying to buy their love or prove anything. I just want them to have the best start in life. It's not about you or me. It's about them." His words struck a chord, and Caroline felt her defenses waver. She had always dreamed of giving her daughters more than she had, and while she had done her best, she couldn't deny that they deserved more. "I'll think about it," she said finally, her voice quiet but firm. David nodded, his relief evident. "That's all I'm asking," he said. "Thank you." As he walked back to join the girls, Caroline leaned against the wall, her thoughts a whirlwind of doubt and possibility. Later that evening, as they settled in for the night, the girls chattered excitedly about their project and the fun they had with David. "He's really nice, Mommy," Leah said, her voice soft but sincere. "Do you think he'll come back tomorrow?" Caroline hesitated, then nodded. "Maybe," she said, her heart aching at the hope in her daughter's eyes. She wanted to believe that David's presence would be a permanent source of joy for them, but her fears kept her from fully embracing the idea. The next week, David invited Caroline and the girls to spend the day at a nearby children's museum. Caroline agreed reluctantly, still wary of how much space she was willing to give him in their lives. The museum was a hit with the girls, who ran from exhibit to exhibit with uncontainable excitement. David followed close behind, his enthusiasm matching theirs as he helped them explore interactive displays and answered their endless questions. Caroline found herself relaxing, her guard lowering as she watched the way David engaged with their daughters. At one point, he caught her eye from across the room and smiled, a genuine expression that sent an unfamiliar flutter through her chest. She quickly looked away, unwilling to dwell on the emotions his presence stirred in her. As the day drew to a close, David suggested stopping for ice cream before heading home. The girls cheered at the idea, and Caroline found herself agreeing despite her initial reservations. Sitting together at a small outdoor table, the five of them laughed and talked, the easy camaraderie surprising Caroline. For a moment, it felt as though they were a family, a thought that both comforted and terrified her. On the way back to the shelter, the girls fell asleep in the back seat of David's car, their faces peaceful in the glow of the passing streetlights. Caroline glanced at David, who was focused on the road, his expression thoughtful. Thank you for today, she said quietly. The girls had a wonderful time. David smiled, his gaze softening as he glanced at her. I should be thanking you, he said, for letting me be part of their lives. It means more than you know. Caroline nodded, her chest tightening at the sincerity in his voice. As much as she wanted to keep him at arm's length, she couldn't deny the impact he was having on their daughters or on her. That night, as she tucked the girls into bed, Caroline felt a flicker of hope she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. The journey ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, she began to believe that they might find a way forward, together. Weeks turned into months, and the tenuous balance Caroline had carefully maintained began to solidify into something more stable. David became a regular presence in the girls' lives, joining them for outings, school events, and quiet evenings at the shelter. Though Caroline remained cautious, she couldn't deny the joy his presence brought to their daughters. Ellie, Leah, and Sarah blossomed under his attention, their laughter ringing louder and their curiosity growing bolder. Caroline, however, wrestled with her own emotions. She had always prided herself on her independence, her ability to provide for her daughters despite the odds stacked against her. Allowing David into their lives felt like relinquishing a piece of that strength, and it left her unsettled. Yet, as she watched him build model rockets with Ellie or listen intently to Sarah's stories, she began to see glimpses of the father she had once hoped he could be. One evening, as the girls played on the floor of the community center, David approached Caroline, his hands tucked nervously into his pockets. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice low. Caroline nodded, leading him to a quieter corner of the room. "What's on your mind?" she asked, folding her arms defensively. David hesitated, then said, "I want to do more for the girls. I know we've been taking things slowly, but I think it's time to consider a more permanent arrangement." Caroline's heart skipped a beat, her mind racing. "What do you mean?" she asked, her tone cautious. "I want to offer you and the girls a place to stay," David said, his gaze steady. "A real home. My home. I know it's a lot to ask, but I want them to have stability, and I want to be there for them every day. You don't have to decide right away, but please, think about it." Caroline's breath caught in her throat. The idea of leaving the shelter and providing her daughters with a secure home was undeniably tempting. But the thought of living under David's roof, of relinquishing the fragile independence she had fought so hard to maintain, filled her with apprehension. "I don't know, David," she said finally. "It's not just about me. It's about what's best for the girls. That's all I want," David said earnestly. "I'm not trying to take anything away from you, Caroline. I just want to give them the life they deserve. And I want to help you, too. You've been carrying this burden alone for so long, but you don't have to anymore." Caroline looked away, her thoughts a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. She knew David's intentions were sincere, but the wounds of their past still lingered, making it hard to fully trust him. "I'll think about it," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. David nodded, his expression softening. "That's all I ask," he said. Over the next few days, Caroline wrestled with the decision. She spoke with the shelter's counselor, who encouraged her to consider what was best for her family's long-term stability. She also watched her daughters closely, noting how their eyes lit up whenever David walked into the room, how their confidence grew with his support. It was clear that he was becoming an important part of their lives, and the thought of taking that away from them felt selfish. One evening, as the girls slept soundly beside her, Caroline made up her mind. She called David and asked him to meet her at the park the next day. When he arrived, she could see the nervous anticipation in his eyes. "I've thought about what you said," she began, her voice steady, "and I think maybe you're right. The girls deserve more than what I can give them alone. But I have conditions." David nodded immediately. "Of course," he said. "Anything." "First," Caroline said, "this isn't about us. This is about the girls. If you think for a second that this means we're going back to how things were, you're mistaken." David's expression sobered, but he nodded in agreement. "Understood," he said. "Second," she continued, "this is temporary. If things don't work out, I'm not afraid to leave. And finally, the girls come first. Always." Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, but she held David's gaze, determined to make herself clear. David stepped closer, his expression serious. "I wouldn't have it any other way," he said. "Thank you, Caroline, for trusting me enough to try this." The following week, Caroline and the girls moved into David's mansion. The transition was overwhelming at first, the stark contrast between their old life and this new reality almost too much to process. But David made every effort to ease the adjustment, creating a warm, welcoming environment for the girls. He set up a playroom filled with books, toys, and art supplies and made sure each of them had a bedroom decorated to their liking. Caroline, however, struggled to find her footing. She spent hours job hunting, determined to contribute financially despite David's reassurances that she didn't need to. She also kept her emotional distance from him, wary of letting her guard down. Yet, as the days turned into weeks, she found herself softening, her walls slowly crumbling under the weight of his consistent kindness and the happiness of their daughters. One evening, after the girls had gone to bed, David found Caroline sitting alone in the garden. He approached cautiously, taking a seat beside her. "You've done an amazing job with them," he said softly. "I don't think I've said that enough." Caroline looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and uncertainty. "I've just done what I had to do," she said. "But this, giving them a home, a family, it's something I never thought they'd have. So thank you." David smiled, the sincerity in his expression undeniable. "We're doing this together," he said. "And I promise you, Caroline, I'm not going anywhere." For the first time, she allowed herself to believe him, her heart daring to hope that maybe, just maybe, they were on the path to healing. Not just as co-parents, but as a family. Caroline adjusted to life in David's home with a mix of awe and caution. The mansion, with its high ceilings, sprawling gardens, and luxurious furnishings, felt like an entirely different world. Yet, despite its grandeur, it wasn't the opulence that captured her attention. It was the way the house came alive with the sound of her daughter's laughter. Ellie, Leah, and Sarah seemed to thrive in their new environment, their energy and joy filling every corner. David, to his credit, made every effort to ensure the transition was smooth. He didn't impose himself on Caroline, respecting her space while continuing to deepen his bond with the girls. He spent his evenings helping with homework, teaching them to play chess, and indulging in their creative pursuits. Caroline often found herself watching from the sidelines, her heart aching with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. One afternoon, as Caroline was in the kitchen preparing snacks for the girls, David walked in, his sleeves rolled up and a warm smile on his face. "Do you need help?" he asked, leaning casually against the counter. Caroline hesitated, then nodded. "Sure," she said, handing him a knife. "You can chop the fruit." They worked in silence for a few moments, the clinking of the knife against the cutting board the only sound. Finally, David broke the silence. "I know this hasn't been easy for you," he said, his voice soft, "but I just want you to know how much I admire what you've done for them. For all of you." Caroline looked at him, her hands stilling as she absorbed his words. "I didn't have a choice," she said quietly. "When you left, I had to be everything for them. There wasn't room for anything else." Her voice was steady, but David could hear the pain beneath her calm exterior. "I was scared," he admitted, his gaze dropping to the countertop. "Back then, I wasn't ready. I know that doesn't excuse anything, but I want you to know that I regret it every day." Caroline swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. She had spent years building a life without him, convincing herself that she didn't need him, that her daughters didn't need him. But now, seeing the way he interacted with them, the way he looked at her with such genuine regret, she felt her carefully constructed walls begin to crack. "It's not just about regret, David," she said finally. "It's about what you do now. Words don't change the past, but actions can shape the future." David nodded, his eyes meeting hers. "I'm here now," he said simply, "and I'll keep showing up, for them and for you if you'll let me." Caroline felt a lump form in her throat, but she didn't reply, instead focusing on arranging the fruit on a platter. That evening, as the family sat together for dinner, Caroline found herself relaxing more than she had in weeks. The girls regaled David with stories from their day, their animated voices filling the room with warmth. Caroline listened, her gaze drifting to David as he laughed at one of Ellie's jokes. He seemed so at ease, so genuine, and for the first time, she allowed herself to wonder if he truly could be the man she and her daughters needed. After the girls went to bed, Caroline found herself in the living room, staring out at the garden. David joined her a few minutes later, handing her a cup of tea. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, sitting beside her on the couch. She shook her head, her thoughts too restless. "There's a lot on my mind," she admitted. David nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I know this isn't easy," he said, "but I hope you know that I'm not going to give up. I want to be a part of this family, Caroline. Not just for the girls, but for you too." His words caught her off guard, and she turned to face him, her eyes searching his for any hint of insincerity. She found none. "I don't know if I can trust that," she said honestly. "You hurt me, David. You hurt us. And I don't know if I can let that go." Her voice trembled, but she held his gaze, refusing to back down. David reached for her hand, his touch gentle. "I understand," he said, "and I don't expect you to forgive me overnight. But I'll spend the rest of my life trying to earn your trust, if that's what it takes." Caroline looked down at their joined hands, her emotions swirling. She wanted to believe him, to believe that people could change, that love could heal even the deepest wounds. But the fear of being hurt again was a powerful barrier. "I don't know if I'm ready," she said softly. David nodded, his expression unwavering. "I'll wait," he said, "for as long as it takes." His words lingered in the air, and for the first time, Caroline felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, he meant them. In the days that followed, their tentative connection grew. They worked together to create a sense of stability for the girls, and in doing so, they found moments of connection that felt natural, even comforting. Caroline began to see David not just as the man who had hurt her, but as the father her daughters deserved, and perhaps as the partner she had once loved. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the girls play in the garden, David turned to Caroline, his expression serious. "I know I've made mistakes," he said, "but I want you to know that I'm all in, for you, for them, for this family. Whatever it takes, I'm here." Caroline looked at him, her heart full of uncertainty but also a small, growing hope. "I don't know what the future holds," she said honestly, "but for the first time, I'm willing to find out." David smiled, his eyes shining with gratitude. "That's all I've ever wanted," he said. And as they sat together, watching their daughters laugh and play, Caroline felt the faintest stirrings of something she hadn't felt in years: peace. The weeks passed, and the once fractured family began to find a rhythm. David's presence became a constant, not only in the girls' lives but also in Caroline's. He took on a more active role, attending school events, helping with bedtime routines, and even learning how to braid hair under Ellie's meticulous supervision. Caroline watched these moments unfold with a mix of cautious optimism and lingering apprehension. For so long, she had been the sole pillar holding their lives together. Sharing that responsibility felt both liberating and terrifying. One weekend, David suggested a trip to the countryside. "The girls have never been outside the city much, have they?" he asked as they sat in the kitchen, the warm morning sunlight filtering through the windows. Caroline shook her head. "No, I've never had the resources for that kind of thing," she admitted. David's eyes softened. "Then let's give them that experience. A weekend away, just us. No distractions, no stress." Caroline hesitated. The idea of stepping out of her comfort zone, of trusting David with something as significant as a family getaway, felt like a leap she wasn't sure she was ready to take. But when she saw the excitement in the girls' eyes as David mentioned the idea to them, she found herself agreeing. "All right," she said, her voice steady despite the knot of nerves in her stomach. "Let's do it." The drive to the countryside was filled with laughter and chatter. The girls pressed their faces against the windows, marveling at the rolling hills and endless stretches of green. David glanced at Caroline from the driver's seat, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "This is good for them," he said softly. Caroline nodded, her heart warming at the sight of her daughter's joy. When they arrived at the small, cozy cabin David had rented, The girls immediately ran off to explore the surrounding woods. Caroline and David stood on the porch, watching them disappear into the trees. "They seem happy," David said, his voice tinged with quiet pride. Caroline folded her arms, her gaze following the girls. "They are," she admitted. "It's been a long time since I've seen them this carefree." The weekend unfolded like a dream. Days were spent hiking, playing games, and roasting marshmallows around a crackling fire. The girls thrived in the open air, their laughter carrying through the trees like music. Caroline found herself relaxing more than she had in years, the weight of her worries lifting with each passing moment. David's presence, once a source of tension, began to feel natural, a welcome addition to their lives rather than an intrusion. One evening, as the girls slept soundly in the loft, Caroline and David sat on the porch, the stars stretching endlessly above them. David broke the comfortable silence, his voice low. "This feels right," he said. "Like we're finally where we're supposed to be." Caroline looked at him, her emotions swirling. She wanted to believe him, to believe that this fragile happiness could last. But the scars of the past still lingered, a constant reminder of how easily things could fall apart. "I don't know if it's that simple," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. David turned to her, his expression earnest. "It doesn't have to be simple," he said. "It just has to be real. And this, us, the girls, this is real, Caroline. I've never been more sure of anything in my life." His words hung in the air, and for a moment, Caroline allowed herself to consider the possibility that he might be right. She thought of her daughters, their faces glowing with happiness, and of the man sitting beside her. The man who had once broken her heart but was now doing everything in his power to mend it. "Maybe," she said finally, her voice soft, "but it's going to take time." David nodded, his expression unwavering. "I'll wait," he said, "for as long as it takes." The drive back to the city was filled with a bittersweet sense of closure. The weekend had been a glimpse of what their lives could be, but Caroline knew that returning to reality would bring its own set of challenges. As they pulled into the driveway of David's home, the girls were already begging to plan their next trip. Caroline smiled, their enthusiasm infectious. "One step at a time, girls," she said, though her heart swelled at the thought of more moments like these. That evening, after the girls were tucked into bed, Caroline found herself sitting on the couch, staring at the family photos David had begun to display on the mantel. Pictures of the girls, of the 5 of them together, smiling and happy. It felt surreal, as though she were looking at someone else's life. David joined her, sitting down beside her without a word. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before he spoke. "I know I've said this before, but I'm grateful for this chance," he said. "For you letting me back into their lives, and yours." Caroline looked at him, her emotions swirling. She still wasn't sure where they were headed, but for the first time, she felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, they were on the right path. "I'm not sure what the future holds," she said honestly, "but I'm willing to see where this goes." David smiled, his relief palpable. "That's all I've ever wanted," he said softly. As the house settled into quiet, Caroline leaned back against the couch, her heart lighter than it had been in years. The journey ahead would be anything but easy, but for the first time, she felt a sense of possibility, a belief that, together, they might just be able to build something lasting and true. Life settled into a cautious yet comforting routine. The days were filled with school drop-offs, shared meals, and moments of laughter that felt increasingly natural. Caroline found herself loosening the grip on her protective instincts, allowing David to take a more active role in their lives. It wasn't easy. Trust was a mountain she wasn't sure she could climb. But with every step David took to prove himself, the path became a little clearer. One evening, David suggested hosting a small celebration for the girls' upcoming birthday. "They've never had a real party before, right?" he asked as they sat in the kitchen after dinner. Caroline hesitated, her initial instinct to reject the idea. Birthdays had always been modest affairs, homemade cakes, small gifts, and heartfelt hugs. The idea of something extravagant felt unnecessary, even indulgent. But when she saw the excitement in his eyes, she paused. "They deserve something special," he said gently. something that makes them feel as loved and celebrated as they are. Let me do this for them, for all of us. Caroline thought of the girls, their wide eyes and infectious giggles. Maybe this was a chance to give them a memory they treasure forever. All right, she said finally, her voice tinged with reluctance. But nothing over the top, David. It's about them, not about showing off. David grinned, relief washing over his face. I promise, he said. Simple but memorable. In the days leading up to the party, the house buzzed with anticipation. David involved the girls in every step of the planning process, letting them pick out decorations, design invitations, and choose their favorite cake flavors. Caroline watched from the sidelines, her heart swelling at the sight of their joy. It was a far cry from the life they had left behind, and though it made her uneasy at times, she couldn't deny the happiness it brought her daughters. The day of the party arrived, and the house transformed into a haven of balloons, streamers, and colorful lights. The girls beamed with excitement as friends from school and the community center arrived, their laughter filling the air. David had kept his promise. There was no lavish spectacle, just a warm, joyful celebration that centered on the girls and their friends. Caroline stood by the kitchen counter, watching as David helped Ellie blow out the candles on her cake. Leah and Sarah cheered beside her, their faces glowing with happiness. For a moment, the weight of her doubts lifted, replaced by a sense of gratitude she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. This wasn't just a party. It was a glimpse of the life she had always wanted for her daughters. Later, as the guests trickled out and the girls curled up on the couch with their new toys, David joined Caroline in the kitchen. You did a good job, she said softly, her arms crossed but her tone warm. David smiled, leaning against the counter. We did a good job, he corrected. You've given them so much, Caroline. This was just a small piece of what they deserve. Caroline looked away, her chest tightening. I'm not used to this, she admitted, relying on someone else, letting someone else share the load. It feels strange. David's expression softened, and he stepped closer. I know it's not easy for you, he said, and I don't take it lightly. But you don't have to do this alone anymore. We're a team now, Caroline. For them, and for each other. His words struck a chord, and Caroline felt a lump rise in her throat. She wanted to believe him, to trust that he wouldn't let them down again. But the scars of the past still lingered, a reminder of how quickly things could fall apart. It's going to take time, she said quietly. David nodded, his gaze unwavering. I'll wait, he said, as long as it takes. That night, after the girls had gone to bed, Caroline sat by the window, looking out at the quiet garden. The house was still, but her mind was anything but. She thought of David, of the ways he had worked to rebuild her trust, and of the happiness he had brought to their daughters. Slowly, the walls she had built around her heart began to crumble, piece by piece. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a future that wasn't defined by struggle and solitude. A future where she didn't have to carry the weight of everything alone. And as the stars shimmered above, she made a quiet decision. She would give David and herself a chance. The weeks that followed were marked by small but significant shifts. Caroline began to open up to David, sharing pieces of herself she had kept hidden for years. In return, he revealed parts of his own journey, his mistakes, and his determination to be better. Together, they began to build a foundation not just for their daughters, but for themselves. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, David turned to Caroline, his expression serious. I know I've said this before, he began, but I'll say it as many times as it takes. I'm grateful for you, Caroline, for letting me back into your life, and for giving me the chance to be the father I should have been all along. Caroline looked at him, her heart full of emotions she couldn't quite name. We're not there yet, she said honestly, but we're getting closer. David smiled, a quiet determination in his eyes. One step at a time, he said, and for the first time, Caroline felt a glimmer of hope that their journey, though far from perfect, was leading them towards something truly beautiful. The fragile trust between Caroline and David continued to grow, inch by inch. Though the scars of their past remained, Their shared commitment to the girls and to rebuilding something meaningful brought a tentative sense of stability to their lives. Caroline still found herself questioning everything: her instincts, her choices, her ability to let someone else share her burdens. But each time David showed up, steady and reliable, her resolve softened just a little more. One Saturday, the family gathered in the living room for what had become a cherished tradition: movie night. The girls had picked a feel-good animated film, and the five of them sprawled out on the couch with bowls of popcorn and blankets. David, sandwiched between Leah and Sarah, was an easy target for their playful teasing, and Ellie narrated the entire film as though no one else could follow the plot. Caroline, sitting at the far end of the couch, watched the scene unfold with a quiet smile. This was the kind of ordinary joy she had always wanted for her daughters, the kind she had once thought impossible. For the first time, she began to see their blended lives not as a compromise, but as a new kind of family, imperfect but deeply rooted in love and effort. After the movie ended and the girls were tucked into bed, Caroline found herself lingering in the living room. David joined her, his expression relaxed but thoughtful. "They had fun tonight," he said, settling into the chair across from her. Caroline nodded, her smile faint. "They're happy," she said. "That's all I've ever wanted for them." David leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "They're happy because of you," he said, "because of everything you've done for them. I'm just lucky to be a part of it." Caroline looked away, her chest tightening. She had spent so long carrying the weight of everything alone. It was hard to accept praise or help. "You've done more than you realize," she said after a pause. "They need you, David. And I'm starting to think, maybe I do too." The words surprised her even as she said them, but once they were out, she felt a weight lift from her chest. David's eyes softened, and he reached for her hand. "You're not alone anymore, Caroline," he said. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." The following week, life threw them a test of their newfound partnership. Ellie had come home from school with a note from her teacher, explaining that she was struggling with reading comprehension and might benefit from additional support. Caroline felt a pang of guilt. Had she missed the signs? Had she failed to give Ellie the tools she needed? But David, ever steady, reassured her. "This isn't a failure, Caroline," he said as they sat together at the kitchen table, the note between them. "It's an opportunity to help her. We'll find a tutor, or I can work with her in the evenings. Whatever it takes." True to his word, David immersed himself in the challenge. He found a tutor who specialized in working with children Ellie's age, and he spent hours sitting with her at the dining room table, helping her sound out words and build her confidence. Caroline watched their sessions from the doorway, her heart swelling with pride and gratitude. David wasn't just present, he was committed. Over time, Ellie's confidence grew. She began reading bedtime stories to her sisters, her voice strong and sure. Caroline marveled at the transformation, feeling a deep sense of relief that she didn't have to navigate these challenges alone anymore. One evening, as she and David cleaned up after dinner, she turned to him and said, "Thank you for everything you've done for Ellie, for all of us." David paused, a dish in his hand, and smiled. "It's what family does," he said simply. The word hung in the air between them, family. It wasn't a word Caroline had allowed herself to embrace fully before, not when it came to David. But now, as she looked at him, she realized that the walls she had so carefully built were no longer as solid as they once were. Later that night, as she tucked the girls into bed, Ellie wrapped her arms around her neck and whispered, "I'm glad we have David, Mommy. He makes everything better." Caroline kissed her daughter's forehead, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. "He's trying his best," she said softly. "And so are we." The next morning, Caroline woke to the smell of coffee brewing and the sound of laughter drifting in from the kitchen. She found David and the girls making pancakes, the counter a chaotic mess of batter and syrup. Ellie and Leah were in charge of flipping the pancakes, while Sarah meticulously arranged fruit slices on each plate. David looked up as she entered, his smile warm and inviting. "Good morning," he said. "We thought we'd surprise you." Caroline chuckled, shaking her head at the mess. "I think the surprise is how much cleaning this will take," she teased. But her heart was full. As they sat down to breakfast, Surrounded by the chatter and laughter of their daughters, Caroline felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. Their journey had been anything but easy, but in that moment, she realized they had created something real, something worth fighting for. David reached for her hand under the table, giving it a gentle squeeze. She looked at him, her heart full of unspoken words. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that they weren't just surviving anymore. They were building a life together. As the seasons changed, so did the rhythm of their lives. The initial uncertainty and hesitations that had marked Caroline's relationship with David began to fade, replaced by a cautious but growing sense of trust. The mansion that once felt foreign became a true home, not just for the girls, but for Caroline as well. Each room carried echoes of laughter, shared meals, and quiet moments that stitched their fractured pasts into a cohesive present. Caroline took steps toward reclaiming her independence, applying for jobs in her field while maintaining her presence in her daughters' lives. Though David had offered to support her entirely, she couldn't let go of her need to contribute. "It's not about pride," she told him one evening as they discussed her plans over tea. "It's about knowing I can stand on my own, even while we're building this together." David respected her resolve, though he insisted on helping where he could. He adjusted his work schedule to ensure he was home for dinner most nights, and when Caroline landed a part-time administrative role at a nonprofit, he celebrated her success as if it were his own. "This is just the beginning," he said, raising a toast at their modest dinner table. "You're amazing, Caroline, and you're going to do incredible things." Their lives intertwined further as they navigated the complexities of parenting. Ellie's reading continued to improve with the help of her tutor, while Leah took an interest in painting, filling the walls of their home with colorful, abstract creations. Sarah, the quietest of the three, developed a fascination with baking, often enlisting David as her sous chef. The kitchen became a hub of activity, filled with the aroma of freshly baked cookies and the sound of the girls' giggles as flour dusted their hair. One evening, after the girls had gone to bed, David found Caroline in the garden, her gaze fixed on the stars. He approached quietly, sitting beside her on the bench. "Penny for your thoughts?" he asked, his voice soft. Caroline smiled faintly, her arms wrapped around herself against the cool night air. "I was just thinking about how far we've come," she said. "Sometimes it feels like a dream, like any moment I'll wake up and it'll all be gone." David reached for her hand, his touch steady and grounding. "It's real, Caroline," he said. "Everything we've built, it's ours. And it's not going anywhere." She turned to him, her eyes searching his face for the truth in his words. Over the past months, he had proven himself time and again, showing up not just for their daughters but for her. He had become her partner in every sense of the word, and though the fear of vulnerability still lingered, it no longer consumed her. "I never thought I'd trust you again," she admitted, her voice trembling. "But you've shown me that people can change. That love can be rebuilt, even after it's been broken." David's eyes glistened with emotion, and he squeezed her hand. "You gave me that chance," he said, "and I'll spend the rest of my life proving I deserved it." Their lives continued to blossom, filled with milestones big and small. Ellie's teacher sent home glowing reports about her progress, while Leah's paintings were displayed in a local gallery's children's exhibit. Sarah's baking earned her a ribbon at the school fair, a moment of pride that David and Caroline celebrated as if she had won a national competition. One Saturday morning, David suggested a family hike in a nearby nature reserve. The girls were thrilled, bundling up in jackets and hats as they piled into the car. Caroline hesitated for a moment before grabbing her camera, a relic of her younger years, when she had dreamed of pursuing photography. "You still use that thing?" David teased as she adjusted the strap around her neck. "Sometimes," she replied with a smile. "It's nice to capture moments like these." The hike was a perfect day of fresh air and bonding. The girls raced ahead, collecting leaves and pointing out birds, while Caroline snapped candid photos of their joy. David walked beside her, his hand brushing hers in quiet reassurance. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Caroline paused to take a photo of the family standing together on a hilltop, their silhouettes framed by the breathtaking view. When they returned home, The girls were too exhausted to stay awake for their usual bedtime stories. Caroline tucked them in one by one, kissing their foreheads and marveling at how much they had grown. As she stepped into the hallway, she found David waiting for her, his expression tender. "Can I show you something?" he asked, leading her to his study. On the desk was a small box, its contents carefully arranged. Inside were mementos of their journey, Ellie's first drawing, a ticket stub from the Children's Museum, and now, a print of the photo Caroline had taken on the hilltop. "I've been keeping these," David said, his voice filled with quiet reverence, "because they remind me of everything we've built, everything we've fought for." Caroline felt a lump rise in her throat, her emotions overwhelming her. She turned to David, her eyes shining. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling, "for not giving up on them, on us." David smiled, pulling her into his arms. "Thank you for letting me back in," he said. "This, our family, is everything I could ever want." As they stood together in the quiet of the study, surrounded by the memories they had created, Caroline felt a profound sense of peace. The journey that had begun with heartbreak and uncertainty had led them here, to a place of love, trust, and hope. And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that their story was just beginning. Thank you for listening until the end. What did you think of this story? If you can, leave your feedback in the comments. It helps me improve and motivates me to keep sharing stories. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give it a like, and activate the notification bell. I'm sure the next video that pops up on your screen will also touch your heart. A big kiss, and see you in the next story.